You know how two people can be mad at something but for different reasons? Like how leftists and conservatives both dislike the Clintons? That's how I feel about Hollywood. And to be clear, I love movies. But I also dislike much of Hollywood as most conservatives do, but not because I think it's filled with liberal elites. Rather, I think it's filled with classical liberals who think they're doing the Lord's work while taking money from conservatives to fund their ambitions and promote a culture of nationalism. Hollywood types are far from the liberal elite in this country. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So today, we're examining the liberal Hollywood myth by specifically examining war films over the years. Let's go. UNFTR. Like a lot of industries, Hollywood follows trends, and when it hits on a successful theme or genre, it's notorious for bludgeoning it to death. Turns out, there's a name for this. It's called wave theory. In the book, Here's Looking at You, Hollywood Film and Politics, the author Ernest Giglio describes wave theory as, quote, where Hollywood releases a batch of films within a concentrated time span. Fair enough. Think of the trove of Vietnam films, for example, that came out in the 1980s. Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, Hamburger Hill, Casualties of War, Good Morning Vietnam, Born on the 4th of July. You're talking about Stone, Coppola, Irvin, Kubrick, Levinson, De Palma. I mean, these are the giants, all released within a 3-year period, and we're still talking about these movies. And there's no doubt that these films both reflected a shifting sentiment toward the war and also helped do the shifting. So as an example, the film industry dealt with Vietnam in two distinct waves that differed in tone and messaging as the country worked through the conflict and began to see it differently with some distance between the end of the war and the release of the waves. So in the first wave, between 78 and 79, you had films like Apocalypse Now, Deer Hunter, and Coming Home. These were mostly dark and contemplative films that sought to work through the psychological toll the war took on those who served. Giglio notes that, quote, the films of the second wave, 85 to 89, are more explicitly critical of the war and symbolize greater cynicism about American involvement, end quote. When I first delved into the topic, there were a few things that I wanted to uncover. The first is the chicken and the egg. Is Hollywood a narrative mirror or driver? The second is whether Hollywood lives up to the bleeding heart stereotype. Turns out, it's really complicated. Hollywood is a bunch of flag-burning pansies. There have been 5 Rambo movies grossing more than $800 million. Hollywood's take on Vietnam was instrumental in turning the tide in this country against a bloated military. Our approved military budget for 2025 is about $1 trillion. Almost no war film has ever glorified the Vietnam War. Hollywood is largely responsible for rehabilitating the image of the American soldier. Some war films are made with funding and support of the government. Others, the government has tried to censor. Successful anti-establishment films like All the President's Men, Network, and Serpico thrived in an era of distrust and rebellion. Jon Favreau and Robert Downey Jr. visited Elon Musk to help model the Iron Man character. So with all these inconsistencies, let's see if we can square the circle. So I want to be clear up front that there is a vast library of art films and documentaries that do an extraordinary job detailing the horrors of war and would have a demonstrable impact were they more widely viewed. But we're focusing on high-profile, high-grossing films that move culture and impact policy. There are also what I'll call war-adjacent movies like Taxi Driver, Indiana Jones, and Inglourious Basterds that provide fictionalized accounts of World War II, or nuclear fallout fiction like War Games or Dr. Strangelove. These films tell us something important about American culture and theoretically move our narrative forward, but we're going to concern ourselves more with classic combat and combat training films. Notably absent will be any comments about G.I. Jane.
Keep my wife's name out your mouth!
To set the table for our conversation, I interviewed Kryn Gabbard, a former Stony Brook University professor and author of multiple books including Psychiatry and the Cinema.
Filmmakers often try to control how audiences actually think about their films. So, for example, in 1971, when Edmund North accepted the Academy Award for Best Screenplay for his work on Patton, the film about World War II General George Patton, North acknowledged that Patton was a war film, but then he added that he hoped it was also a peace film, which was kind of a stretch.
Patton is a really good starting point for us because it really does paint a picture of audience perspective. The biases one brings to the film likely impact your interpretation of it, regardless of the director's intent. What makes Patton such a haunting example isn't necessarily the audience reaction to the film, whether you viewed Patton as a hero or a fool. In this case, there's a chilling policy connection to the film, as it's been widely reported that Nixon made the decision to engage in the secret bombing of Cambodia after a private screening of Patton in the White House. So in this instance, we don't have to guess at the psychological impact of the film, because in this case, it's partially responsible for the actions of a single individual wielding life and death authority. Let's go back to the beginning of Hollywood and film production so we can find even more direct and disturbing connections. I'll give you one domestic and one foreign to illustrate the power of film as pure propaganda. So, the very first film ever screened in the White House was for known racist President Woodrow Wilson. D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which glorified white nationalism and a little group called the KKK. And in many ways, this film had as profound an effect on the national psyche regarding racism as Leni Riefenstahl's pro-Nazi film Triumph of the Will. Though separated by many years, both were considered masterpieces of filmmaking and were used to deliberately shift the public's mindset and view, and they were massively successful. It's interesting that we're still having these kinds of conversations. Now, not every situation is as black and white as Nixon jerking off to Patton before systematically murdering hundreds of thousands of innocent people. The chicken and egg question of whether Hollywood portrays influence or reflects culture is similar to the conversations we're still having about rap music or gaming culture. Frankly, there's more to suggest that it's the egg. Or is it the chicken? Fuck it. There's more than enough evidence to suggest that it was understood early on that deliberately leveraging film as cultural propaganda was a way to sell policy and shift attitudes. Woodrow Wilson himself appointed a man named George Creel to basically run film propaganda to, quote, sell the war to America, after Wilson went back on his isolationist campaign promise and decided to enter World War I. Wilson's experience and success in selling the American people on the war even led FDR to establish the Bureau of Motion Picture to help guide the film industry as a contributor to the Second World War effort. That's not to say that Hollywood didn't have or doesn't have a conscience. In fact, arguably the most powerful man in Hollywood at the time, Charlie Chaplin, used his power and platform to both satirize dictators and send a powerful message of hope and peace. Hey there, quick note for those who dig what we do on UNFTR. Beyond YouTube, we have a whole world of content and collaborations over at UNFTR.com, and I'd love you to check them out. There you can sign up for our free weekly newsletter that comes out every Saturday, recapping important news stories from the week from progressive news outlets around the world. It also has an economic chart of the week, book and podcast recommendations, and a weekly progressive spotlight on a leftist figure doing good in the world. So go to UNFTR.com to sign up today, and if you're interested in joining the community, there's information on how to support us, from memberships to purchasing our own line of coffee called Unfuck Your Morning, manufactured in partnership with native coffee traders, roasted by tribal members in New York. Purchasing the coffee helps support our work and employment on the reservation. Now back to the show. When we talk about war films, there are a few categories in movies that kind of cross over. There are the disillusionment films that aren't necessarily combat-centric, like Jarhead, Coming Home, Lions for Lambs, Brothers, Green Zone, and The Hurt Locker. Now, The Hurt Locker was a harrowing film by Kathryn Bigelow, starring Jeremy Renner, and it was notable on a number of fronts. First of all, it took a different look at war from the perspective of soldiers tasked with disarming improvised explosive devices. And it was directed by a woman. This film took home 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and while it ultimately only grossed about $50 million, it was considered by many to be a really important anti-war film, but one that also portrayed the struggle of American soldiers, male soldiers in particular, in both a gut-twisting and sympathetic light, a difficult line to navigate for a filmmaker. To counter this type of narrative, there are what I'll call war-affirming films, whether or not that was truly the intent. These are usually big, sweeping affairs such as Pearl Harbor, Bridge over the River Kwai, Patton, The Great Escape, Uncommon Valor, We Were Soldiers, Heartbreak Ridge, Hacksaw Ridge, or Black Hawk Down. War-adjacent and slightly different stories should include Private Benjamin, Stripes, Officer and Gentleman, Taps, and The Great Santini. These are more character-driven stories where troubled protagonists find redemption through military discipline. Not explicitly glorifying war, but certainly part of the affirming aspect of the genre. Even films like those in the Rambo series speak to the horrors of war and what it does to a person, while also affirming the hero's journey through masculinity, discipline, and bloodlust. Though the first in the series, First Blood, is actually a far more nuanced telling considering the villains in the movie were themselves combat veterans of a different time.
I'm expendable.
Now, it's hard to believe that Sly Stallone put out an important war film, but I would argue that First Blood, while birthing an over-the-top and ultimately ridiculous series, was a really important movie, even if it contained the fatal flaw that we'll talk about later. Perhaps the most controversial film that falls under this category is the 2014 release American Sniper, starring Bradley Cooper as Sniper Chris Kyle, directed by Clint Eastwood. It's important not to underestimate the impact of this film on our nationalistic culture today. Despite Eastwood's claim that it is an anti-war film, the subject of the film became nothing short of a national hero for being the most effective sniper in the history of the military. It's an extremely controversial film on several fronts, as Kyle would both be revered on the right and reviled on the left for his characterization of Iraqis as, quote, savages and how he enjoyed killing them. Kyle was killed at a shooting range at the height of his popularity, but he did live long enough to take in much of the controversy over his statements in the film, much of which had to do with an increasing number of people coming out of the woodwork to debunk several of his claims of heroism and actions during combat. For some in the military and on the right, however, Kyle remains a hero. Forget the fact that he harbored such hatred and contained bloodlust to murder people in a country that we were invading. He despised the very people we were supposedly liberating, adding to the already growing confusion over our operation and objectives in Iraq. The movie wound up being one of the highest grossing war films of all time, pulling in $350 million worldwide so far. Now, as a quick aside to round out the general categories of war film that Hollywood loves, we have lighter, more satirical takes such as Stripes, MASH, Three Kings, and Good Morning Vietnam. These are just a few examples of war and war-adjacent films that were extremely popular and contained contradictory messages. At times, glorifying war, at others, the opposite, but all done with either a gentle or absurd touch that leaves the audience less conflicted about war and remembering the funny, absurd, or satirical aspects of conflict. Now, before we move on to the next section, there is one film that's difficult to place: Saving Private Ryan. As we'll talk about shortly, World War II films are kind of easier for us to digest because there's historical consensus that this was the so-called just war. And it checks so many boxes, and it makes a really compelling study. I mean, by all measures, Saving Private Ryan is a blockbuster. Veterans were astounded by the realism. It portrayed the horrors endured by ordinary men drawn into an extraordinary situation that really tugs on the heartstrings as well. Now, we know that there are no winners in this, and we're also saddened by what they go through, and yet we're uplifted at the same time. Like much of Spielberg's work, it's somehow simultaneously unoffensive yet important, cinematic yet gritty. Now, some may disagree, but I find it sits neatly, almost innocuously, in nearly every camp. An example of a masterpiece of filmmaking, even if one isn't inclined to give credit to a director that many think is incapable of producing an art film. Now, much of how we view Hollywood depends upon who the bad guy is. Nazis, communists, Muslims, and how real or perceived are these threats. Hollywood has tied itself in knots over the past 100 years, trying to walk a fine line between being on the right side of history and making money. After all, even though Hollywood is our chief cultural export, it's a business, and that's an important part of the conversation. See, much of Hollywood's money is made overseas. So when it comes to war, and when you're a country that is perpetually at war and constantly finding new bad guys, it's an even more difficult path because unhinged jingoism isn't nearly as appealing in other markets as it is here. It's one of the reasons that, save for a handful of films, the war genre doesn't perform as well as fantasy or sci-fi. I mean, you have to go all the way back to 1957 with Bridge Over the River Kwai to find a pure war film that also wound up as the highest grossing film of the year. I think Hollywood since World War II can really be looked at as a bell curve, though the trajectory of the curve depends upon your perspective. And much of this can be viewed by how we define our enemy, but also by the nation's general sentiment towards our entanglements, past and present. For example, as Giglio notes, quote, "The Russians were portrayed heroically in two 1943 films, The North Star and Days of Glory." Now, it wouldn't take long for the nation's mood to change course on the treatment of communists, though this was obviously mired in controversy as Hollywood found itself in the crosshairs of the U.S. government during the Red Scare and McCarthy hearings. Again, Giglio, quote, "Hollywood's most obvious ideological period occurred during the Red Scare of the 1940s and 1950s, when the film industry churned out a number of films like The Iron Curtain, I Married a Communist, The Red Menace, I Was a Communist for the FBI, and Big Jim McClane, all of which sought to frighten the American public into believing that a communist takeover was imminent," end quote. But the sure bet during this period was still World War II, with Hollywood releasing 9 combat films in 1949 alone, including Sands of Iwo Jima, which grossed $25 million, which was a huge figure at the time. Heading out of the 1950s, though, there was an important shift in the government's influence over the content of film with the formal end of what was known as the Production Code. See, the Production Code was established in the 1930s under Postmaster General Will Hayes to, in his words, set up high standards of performance for motion picture producers, considerations which good taste and community value make necessary in the universal form of entertainment. It was an acknowledgement by the government of the growing influence and power of film over American culture, initially designed to ensure that, quote, "the sympathy of the audience shall never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin," end quote. But by the 1950s, Hollywood found a way to skirt the code on decency grounds, though the government would wield the very ambiguous sentiment of the code to enforce anything that smacked of communist sympathy. But by the 1960s, the country began to enter into a period of moral crisis. The clear-cut morality of World War II had disintegrated into a nebulous battle between unseen Cold War actors that somehow posed a threat to democracy. Outside the clear and present danger of nuclear fallout, which Hollywood did in fact engage with often, war films began to wrestle with the growing disillusionment with our foreign campaigns. As Ryan and Kellner write in their book Camera Politica, quote, "In 1971, American culture was still very much a contested terrain. It would be a mistake to assume that the appearance of films reacting against the 60s constituted a full-fledged capitulation on the part of Hollywood to an emerging conservative movement," end quote. Soon, films by a new generation of filmmakers, freed of the shackles of the Production Code, were testing new grounds and painting a less than rosy picture of combat and the plight of veterans returning home. The Vietnam movies, done in the aforementioned waves, are still some of the most important depictions of Hollywood and the country struggling with its identity. But what we started to witness was a shift in animus from the soldier to bureaucrat, military to government. Many of the Vietnam-era films successfully split the government and the U.S. military into two distinct bodies, with the government responsible for our sins and soldiers as the unfortunate moral casualties. Nevertheless, it's difficult to measure where the intent begins. Again, whether Hollywood is a mirror or influencer in manifesting this cultural shift. Today, one of the more curious chicken and egg scenarios is how and when the tide turned against Arabs and Muslims. I mean, even before 9/11, Hollywood was in search of a new enemy at the end of the Cold War. So movies like True Lies, The Siege, Rules of Engagement, Sum of All Fears, and Unthinkable put the Arab and Muslim world squarely in America's crosshairs. So did these films help set the stage for anti-Islamic rhetoric in the nation, or was it just inevitable after 9/11? Again, it's hard to tell, but I think it's fair to argue that the cumulative effect of movies such as these helped pave the way for a general acceptance of Islamophobia and helped create a culture of fear that manifested in almost universal support for perpetual war against an entire religion. Perhaps the most egregious example of Hollywood taking liberties during the War on Terror is the dramatization of the capture of Osama bin Laden in Zero Dark 30. The film has become an almost laughable meme of everything wrong with Hollywood's portrayal of American heroism in the face of evil, partly because it's a fictionalized account of current events with myriad inconsistencies and composite characters. But the more detrimental aspect of the film is that it leads audiences to believe that the CIA's illegal use of torture, known as rendition, may have been responsible for unearthing bin Laden's location, leading to his capture. This idea has been thoroughly debunked, though it's doubtful that American audiences who love the film are any the wiser. Curiously, the film lists Catherine Bigelow as a producer, and it was a huge success, grossing more than $130 million, more than 3 times what it cost to make. Not exactly a lesson to Hollywood not to play fast and loose with the facts or our emotions. Okay, so it's pretty clear that Hollywood has, at a minimum, an ambiguous record on war with respect to how liberal its take is. Many of the films depicting Vietnam can certainly be fairly characterized as anti-war, but then again, it seemed to have a minimal effect on the nation's tolerance or propensity for war. Nevertheless, the myth of the liberal Hollywood elitist persists. I wonder why.
I think there is a lot of gnashing of teeth in Hollywood and among other progressive elites.
Hollywood has acted almost as a megaphone for the left.
Hollywood and the entertainment industry have long been a bastion of liberalism.
Oh, that's right, because conservative media says so. And because so many actors and actresses are self-proclaimed liberals and have such high profiles in our culture, it's understandable why it's an easy trope to pursue. But there's also the fact that we've acknowledged before, the movie business is indeed a business. It's a pure capitalist enterprise where even the most liberal actor finds themselves doing the work and then hopefully someday assuaging their guilt by selecting an art film or nabbing producing credits on a documentary. So they typically refer to this as one for them and one for me. No matter how many excellent war documentaries get made, though, the fact of the matter is that our culture is influenced by the films that put asses in seats and eyes in front of screens. Plus, Americans aren't ones to dwell, and we don't like feeling badly about ourselves for too long. But the question still remains as to who is influencing whom. The big takeaway, when you look out across the 5,000 war films that Hollywood has pumped out over the last century, and nearly all of the ones that we covered today, is that with very few exceptions, they're missing the perspective of the other side. Even the great supposed anti-war films of the Vietnam era, which are as honest as any in the genre. The exceptions, by the way, are sometimes remarkable, but they're also notable for how painful they are to watch. Movies like Angelina Jolie's In the Land of Blood and Honey, which many consider to be the best film on the Bosnian War, or De Palma's Redacted, a blistering expose of the brutal rape of a 15-year-old Iraqi girl by American soldiers. These exceptions might be outstanding, but in terms of impact on our consciousness and psyche, they're marginal at best. Most successful Hollywood war films, no matter how real or how brutal or how provocative, can mostly be characterized as white military male savior films. Films that put the fighting man at the center. Even if the character performs horrific acts of violence and depravity such as those depicted in a film like Platoon, they're explained away as the horrors that occur in the fog of war. War made by bureaucrats and thrust upon young soldiers seeking honor, perhaps revenge, or simply money to pay for college. I mean, who did you root for in A Few Good Men? Whether you rooted for the Nicholson character or not, he's the more memorable figure. Because the heart of liberalism exposes the desire to have that character on the wall, and the rest of us are happy not to ask the questions. Who was the more enduring character of the movie Wall Street? Bud Fox or Gordon Gekko? Sometimes films have the opposite effect of even what the filmmaker intended, because the dastardly characters unlock some secret part of us, and they're typically the more memorable figures. Support the troops, salute the flag, approve the budget. Perhaps no institution is more responsible for normalizing these sentiments and celebrating a toxic culture of militarism and bravado more than liberal Hollywood, filled with all those pinko commie leftist elites that the right wing loves to vilify. The era of the war film might indeed be over, but it's only because it's uninteresting, no longer fertile ground for capitalist exploitation, And so long as service isn't compulsory, the liberal masses can look the other way, while conservatives in Congress, whose kids will probably never see combat, can just cheer them on. It's best to remember that all films, on some level, are propaganda. The trick is to figure out who ultimately benefits from the message. See, Hollywood isn't liberal. Hollywood is capitalist. Here endeth the lesson.
Most filmmakers look for ways to appeal to both audiences, and that is something we have to keep in mind if we are going to categorize a film as pro-war or anti-war.